we often recite the creed using uh using using the plural pronoun we, right? So we believe such and such a thing, which for some people helpfully means that on the day when they don't know whether they believe in the Holy Spirit, can still say we believe in the Holy Spirit, because we do, right? Like I don't now, right? But I did last week, and I might next week. But I can still say the we because there's more than me here, and I think belonging to a tradition is helpful in that sense too. Uh, because right, like there isn't that pressure at every moment in time to have made sense of every bit of the edifice.
So then the atheist complaint this whole time is, okay, that's cool, nice story, bro, but is it true? Welcome back to If I'm Really Honest, where I seek truth without tribalism. It's like finding God despite religion, or making discoveries despite consensus, or being honest despite the expectations of me. Now, as a teacher, I've always told my students who didn't know what to read next, go to your favorite nonfiction book, go to the bibliography, and read the people who influenced your favorite people. And that's precisely how I got to today's guest. This name, Jonathan Lewis-Jong, keeps showing up.
I'd also recommend this article by Jonathan Lewis-Jong.
There's a paper by Jonathan Lewis-Jong and colleagues. I don't think Jonathan is the first author.
Dr. Jonathan Lewis-Jong.
Dr. Jonathan Lewis-Jong.
And I gotta say, he exceeded expectations. So hopefully someday I'll get to have a part 2 with Dr. Jonathan Lewis-Jong.
I never intended to be a parish priest. I was always going to be an academic, and the priest thing was sort of, I would do on Sunday mornings and that kind of thing. But then we had a baby during COVID, and decided that we needed help, so we moved back to where my wife's family are from, which is not, but it was a city, so we moved to a kind of city nearby to here. And then 2 weeks later, this job came up. Which is 3 parishes, so three churches in 4 small villages, of which mine is the largest. So if you can only imagine, 450 people, that is the largest village. But one of the churches is where my wife's family are buried. So when the job came up, I called the bishop and I said, look, you couldn't pay me enough money to be a parish priest. Who wants to do that for a living? But let me help out, right? Because this patch is of some significance to my family. And then bishops do, the bishop did what bishops do, and now I'm here forever.
Enlighten me. What does it mean exactly to be a parish priest?
Oh, yeah, okay. I guess you don't really have this so much in the States. So you know how in like as it were, a normal church, your job is to be the priest for the congregation who come, right? And then to some extent there's outreach to the kind of surrounding neighborhoods, right? The parish system, which is a medieval system, kind of carves up the country into territories, parishes. And in the old days, there would be one church per parish, which is roughly one church per village in rural areas. And then a city would be carved up into a bunch of parishes by neighborhood, and then there'll be one church per neighborhood. So this is before cars, you see, right? So everyone had to walk to church. And the parish priest has what we call the cure of souls, which is just an old-fashioned way to say the care of people in the whole parish, regardless of whether they come to church, right? So being the parish priest is a bit like being a minister at a church, which is to say you have a congregation and there's a building and there's work. There are services, and you do weddings and baptisms and all the rest of it. But there's also a kind of more nebulous civic role.
It sounds kind of like the Mormon system. Are you familiar with that?
No, I don't know about that.
Okay, I think it's or like we have like school districts where like if you live in this neighborhood, then your kids have to go to this school unless you get special permission or whatever.
Right.
And the Mormon church system, it sounds similar in that like the church decides where churches get built because they like govern a certain area.
So in the Middle Ages, that was less true. So we never had separation of church and state in this country, right? Because we were sort of part of the Holy Roman Empire, and so it's like since the 4th century, the Catholic Church and then its successor, the Church of England, was entirely enmeshed in the kind of echelons of power. And so it's not so much the church decides which parishes should have churches, so much as kind of rich and powerful people decide, well, I have money, I'm going to build a church in this village, and then I'm going to tell the bishop to send the priest there. And like that's sort of how it evolves over time. And then eventually, basically every village has a priest. In part because on one hand, sometimes aristocrats say, I'm going to build a church here, so there will be one. And then the bishops started noticing that this happens, and then they then turn around to say, well, if you're going to build a church here, here's another village which needs a church. Why not build a church there? Right? And then so it goes. And it gets a bit more complicated because, it used to be that certain kinds of families would give up one of their sons to be priests. Right. So someone decides that, well, you're the younger son, off you go to the church, right? And then the kind of wealthier families tend to be able to set up their sons to go to quite fancy churches. And then the less well-off, they end up in kind of poorer parishes. So there's a lot of social and economic inequality in the Middle Ages. But all that has been kind of more or less rationalized since the 20th century. It's very new that it's rational. So all the church land got nationalized, and you don't really have rich and poor parishes in quite the same way as there was in, which is not to say there's no income, there's no wealth inequality. Of course there is, but it's much less than it was. It's a much more sensible system now, but it's all kind of medieval inheritance. So my job is to be the priest of the congregation, but also I would say most of the people I visit are people who don't come to church, but I am the guy, right? Like if you need someone to visit you who is not your sister or your daughter, and you are 92 and you need help, then you call the parish priest. Like that's and it doesn't matter whether you believe in God. Most people don't believe in God, I think here. England is very secular. So they don't necessarily just see me as the religious functionary. Like I'm just the guy who is supposed to be helpful.
Like my experience is like there's a calling, and then like you decide whether or not you want to be a pastor, and then it's mostly a Sunday morning show, and that's kind of the thing you do here.
Yeah.
So then, how important is it that you match the beliefs of the governing body to be a parish priest? If a lot of your job sounds kind of secular-ish, it sounds like good humanitarianism. Yeah,
that's a good question. So I would say first there is of course the Sunday service, right, which is by canon law compulsory, but it's also compulsory for priests, regardless of what the job is, to say morning and evening prayer. So kind of the job is to pray. Right. There's very little in the ordinal and the job description that is the kind of everyday lived reality of the thing I just described, which is visiting people who don't go to church and helping to organize their shopping and that kind of thing. And in some ways, I don't want to divorce the two things, right? So the social work, if you like, flows out of the life of worship, and those two things I think are inextricable in the sense that to be true to your life of worship, the social work kind of has to be entailed, right? This is kind of faith and works, right? But also on the other hand, I think that the job is not that of a social worker, right? Like I think a parish priest who does all the social work stuff, who doesn't then do the praying and the celebrating the mass, like wouldn't really be fulfilling their vows, and wouldn't be doing the job per se. Okay, so your question is one about belief. Episcopalians, which is what you call us in your country, and Anglicans, which is what we call them everywhere else. I think there's a reputation, right, that the Anglicanism is a little bit wishy-washy or a bit liberal, and you can kind of like believe whatever you like. I think Robin Williams, the comedian, used to say that he liked Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, because it was like Catholicism with half the guilt. Right, and I recognize that, right. There is some truth in this, and certainly in the 1960s, in this country, in England, I don't know about the American situation. In the 1960s, the Church of England was very liberal, and you had lots of clergy who, on one hand, kind of inherited their careers from their parents, right? You had like 3 generations of priests, sort of thing, and that goes back a long way, but it kind of ended in the 60s, and so that generation was the last of their kind, of people who were like 3rd generation clergy. So you had them on one hand, and sometimes they're the same people, and then on the other hand, there's a kind of move to receive like critical scholarship about the Bible and engaging with like philosophical and scientific questions, and the trend in the late 60s was towards liberalism. There was this liberal Protestant stuff that came out of Germany and it arrived in England, and so and in the States you have German theologians like Tillich, who are writing in a kind of like in a sort of liberal mode, right? There's a lot of like non-literalism going on. What is the resurrection anyway? Didn't it just happen in the minds of the disciples, right? What is God, if not another word for the good, or something like this, right? And that's fine, right? But right, and then in this country again, there are movements like the Sea of Faith movement associated with someone called Don Cupid at Cambridge. You have something kind of similar in the States. There's a guy whose name I've now forgotten, Lloyd something, his bishop, who's kind of a Christian atheist, right? So you had that kind of stuff going on in Anglicanism in the English speaking world at the time, but that sort of has died. On average, like a priest who trains now are kind of paid up believers. I think as a class we're relatively conservative. We're moderately conservative, right? Not necessarily on social issues, right? So the average parish priest in this country is still just about like a sort of political liberal. In American terms, they would be a Democrat, right? In British terms, they'll be a Labour voter. So that there are more Labour voters among the clergy than there are conservative voters, Republicans in your on your side of the Atlantic. So there's a lot of like political and social progressivism in the clergy. But gone are the days when we would cross our fingers behind our backs when we say the creed, right? Gone are the days when people would say that they believe in God as a metaphor or the resurrection as a dream or something like this. I mean, I think most clergy I meet now definitely believe that Jesus rose from the dead on the 3rd day, like for reals, right?
Yeah, right.
In a kind of in a.
It's funny you have to say that.
Yeah, indeed. So right, but it is true that once upon a time, Anglican clergy had a reputation of being really liberal. So I think of myself as quite conservative theologically, but quite progressive socially and politically, and I've never really seen the problem putting those two things together. I think that's true for most of my colleagues, and I think it is sort of my job to be more theologically orthodox, if you like, than my parishioners. Like I don't need them to believe in God, right? I don't need them to have like a particularly robust understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity, but like I expect myself to.
Yeah, somebody should. Like you need a guy to go to.
Right, exactly. Like in the same way that if I were a punter and wasn't a priest and wanted to go to church, like I would want to go to a place where like the guy in the pulpit like believes the stuff he's saying, or she, right? So like I think it's important, and I think if I ever decided that I have done the job of deconstruction so well that I no longer believe any of this, like then I should find a new job, I think.
Okay, so then what does that word mean to you, deconstruction?
What? Yeah. So I don't know, I can't remember what your kind of like denominational journey is, but I started off life in Malaysia, and in Malaysia everyone is everyone who is a Christian is a kind of evangelical Christian, right? It's quite a conservative place religiously, Christianly, that is. And so when I arrived at university, there was a lot of stuff that I had to kind of rethink, and the resources available to me at the time. So this was the kind of, if you like, early 2000s to to kind of pre-2010s, right? So all the like Brian McLaren kind of stuff, right? The kind of Richard Kearney on the kind of fancier, kind of more philosophical end of things, like all that was in the air, right? The kind of emergent Christianity stuff was in the air. The Scott McKnights of the world were rethinking their own thing as well. So I think I thought of deconstruction at the time as a matter of kind of first kind of picking apart the inheritance, right? These are the beliefs that I accepted as what I meant to be a Christian, right? And I had to kind of, I guess, examine the pieces and then kind of separately, and then also to see whether or not they cohere together as a whole. But in some ways, even more important than that, at least for me, I think this is less true for some other kind of traditions of deconstruction. But at least for me, it was important to then go, okay, here are the pieces, and here is the attempt to put them together. But wait a second, how do other people look at these pieces? How do other Christians look at these pieces, right? Like I think I became very aware that the Christianity into which I was converted as a teenager, wasn't the only Christianity available, and in fact, was in some ways quite a new kind of Christianity, right? Like so I became a Christian at 16, and then so all this stuff happens in my early 20s, and I had never, I had never read the Church Fathers, right? It didn't even occur to me that they were Christians in the Middle Ages, right? I mean, like, it's not strictly speaking true, but like, it would never have it didn't occur to me to think, oh, like, I wonder what medieval Christians thought about something, I think the oldest thing I read was probably John Wesley, because I went to a Methodist church.
That sounds about right.
Yeah,
I can relate. Okay.
So part of deconstruction was also a kind of like going back to the roots, right? And by that I don't just mean the very evangelical thing of let's read Acts 2 again, right? Well, like, which of course I did. Like, I also did that.
Yeah, sure.
But also, like, wait a second, I've now broken down these things that that I'm not so sure about, and maybe that I am sure about, and like, but should I be sure about these things? But wait a second, like, do other Christians think the same thing about these things? And if not, why not? And do they have a different way of putting it together? So deconstruction in that sense became a kind of comparative project for me too. And I went from like conservative Pentecostal to Anglican with nothing in between, right? I left this sort of Assemblies of God kind of quasi-independent Pentecostal church, and 3 months later turned up at like a very traditional Book of Common Prayer style Anglican service, and that sort of never turned back since. So it was a seamless transition.
Honestly, that sounds like a relatively common story for people who are leaving, who can't feel like they can't hold on to the Pentecostal evangelical fundamentalism that they want to hold on to, but they just can't for lots of different reasons. Like, it's kind of like you're holding on to like the new modern plastic version of the thing, and then like, well, if you're gonna hang on to this thing, like, go get the real thing, like go be a real Christian. It's
sort of interesting. So I know that some ex-evangelical, is that evangelicals?
Sure, that's a word.
Yeah. People say that in the States. I think we don't have that so much here. But so I know some people end up going to like Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, and that. So the story there is, I guess, I think your plastic thing. Let's go get the kind of like real, full, like hot-blooded version of this thing,
right?
And I see some of that in myself, right? Because I do think of myself as quite conservative theologically, and then I know other people in the States, in particular, who became Episcopalians, right? And so so I'm thinking of people like Pete Enns, right? Who wrote that kind of Evolution and Adam book, got into lots of trouble with his denomination, and then kind of gave up that particular brand of evangelicalism, and then now is an Episcopalian, and that story is kind of like often told, but I think they tend to kind of move in a kind of more liberal direction theologically than kind of the position I occupy. So in that sense, I'm a bit more like the people who went off to become Eastern Orthodox, but I didn't feel the need to go all the way to orthodoxy, right, or Roman Catholicism.
Part of the problem for me in my, what people would label as deconstruction, I don't really know if that's a useful term or not, but like what you're saying, like, well, if I want to go back to the original, maybe I just go back and like read the Bible. Like maybe that'll tell me what Christianity is supposed to be, except it's impossible to actually get rid of this filter that I have reading the Bible. There's so much that we read into it that it's almost impossible to actually have like get at the document itself. And so then I find that if I end up going to biblical scholars, then to like actually find out what's the truth about these texts, they don't point me in a direction that gets me back to where I want to go.
Sure.
And so that's where I feel like I kind of lose. Well, I can go, like I can either have the modern interpretation of these texts, or I can go back to, the second, third, fourth century interpretations of these texts, or I can go back to the first century interpretation of these texts, if we're going to say they were written in the first century. And it's like whose Christianity do I want to steal?
Right, right.
Which one do I want to borrow?
Where is the golden age, right? If there is a golden age, like let's go find it and then let's occupy. So I think that project surely doesn't work, right? I mean, for the reasons that you mentioned.
I agree.
Right?
Yes.
And so I think. And I think that occurred to me too, right? That in the early 2000s, when I thought, well, yeah, right, like let's get rid of all that kind of dross, right? And to some extent, I had that attitude because it was encouraged by Pentecostalism, right? Like the very Protestant critique of all that like Catholic Orthodox faffing about with ritual is precisely this, like we want this more kind of pure form of Christianity, right? We read Acts 2 like it's the only part of the Bible that's worth reading like every single day, right? We want to go back to being the Acts 2 church. Like the Pentecostals love that, and I loved it too. And so when I was leaving, I think I carried that ethos with me to go like, wait, okay, so I'm leaving this thing, but I want to leave it to something even more pure, right? But I think it didn't take long for me to realize that is impossible, because right, either the past and its theology is like lost to us in some way, or untenable for other reasons, or I think kind of more to your point maybe, that any choice of where to land chronologically in the history of Christian theologizing is arbitrary, right? And I think, I mean, I'm not suggesting that there's a non-arbitrary way to kind of pick a tradition, right? But I think I ended up thinking, what do I make if I can't reject tradition? Then what do I make of tradition, right? Like what is it, and how do I pick one? Like I don't know. I'm not persuaded by the people who think that there's an answer to the question, which tradition should you pick, right? Like, and let's come up with the choices, and we go like, well, we could be Anglicans or Coptic Christians or Eastern Orthodox or Roman Catholics, and then there's a pro and cons list, and then you go with one. Like I'm just not persuaded that that's like a reasonable method, right? I think I optimize for certain things. Like I think my dispositional conservatism does make me want to participate in a tradition that goes back a long way, right? Like I do desire that kind of historical continuity, right? Like I'm not intuitively a kind of revolutionary in that sense. So I'm not happy to, I don't know, like be a Baptist or something, right? And like that's just too
Okay,
new, right?
Yeah.
So it has to be ancient, right? And then but then of the ancient traditions, at that point I sort of think, like there's no choosing between them, right? That at that point it's kind of a matter of taste, right? It's a matter of aesthetics, where if you want a very like top down pyramidical ecclesiology, then you become Roman, right? If you like to pretend that nothing has changed for 2,000 years, then you become Eastern Orthodox, right? Who will say things like, oh yeah, like our liturgy has not changed for 2,000 years. It's not true, right? But
it's a good story.
Yeah, it's a good story. But but then if you appreciate a little bit of like mess, right? If you think, well, the story of Anglicanism is that some king wants to marry some lady and then decides that, well, for this reason, I'm going to break up with the Pope, and there's something delightfully human and messy. And there's no way we can pretend, like no Anglicans pretend that our history isn't like fucked up, right? And so I found that really attractive, right? I found the commitment to historicity coupled with like the blatant fact of the kind of historical contingency and messiness of Anglicanism, like really compelling. I thought this looks like the way I'm a Christian, right? Like there's this like commitment, and then there's also a lot of messiness. And I think these two things, I thought, yeah, like this is a place that feels like home to me, and that was it basically.
Well, and that feels to me as like a key component of the religious experience. Like I'm having this experience. I have this relationship with the divine or the holy or numinous or whatever it is. And I want a story that uses vocabulary that matches what my experience is.
Right.
And when it's incoherent with what I experience, then that's a cult. I that's what I call that thing.
Yeah.
Because like that can't possibly be true because it doesn't feel true. And when I'm given the words that finally feel like, yes, like this is home, like this language understands me, then I can't help but be compelled by it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the risk of that, of the choice that I've made, right, of this way of thinking about things is a kind of complacency, right, where you then, it's possible that you then foreclose the possibility that the tradition and its vocabulary disrupts your spirituality, right? And I think I having made the choice I made, I run the risk of having kind of an easy spiritual life, because it all resonates, right? It all makes sense, and I think that I have to kind of keep guard against that kind of complacency, right? And because I think it can lead to a kind of idolatry, in thinking that I'm in the right church and I have the right beliefs and have the right kind of spirituality, but like I don't know if any of that is true, right? And so maybe sometimes it's good to be prodded and nudged and disturbed and but even that is one of the nice things about Anglicanism, is that it's such a kind of like broad. I'm really not trying to sell Anglicanism. This is for me.
It sounds romantic, like I said. It's
But we fight all the time, right? Like I occupy the like ludicrously like spiky high church incense and bells, like singing songs to Mary end of Anglicanism, right? But I have friends who are very much straight down the line Protestants, who think that all this stuff is crazy, right? But we all somehow manage, not very well, but we sort of manage to stick together. But the result of us sticking together is that there is constant disruption, right? That within the communion, I don't get to feel comfortable all the time, because within the communion there are we just disagree about very basic things, but we share enough in common that we can get together and receive communion or say morning prayer or whatever, right? And so I think I run the risk of having found a spirituality that matches, or rather finding a tradition that matches my spirituality too well. But the guard against that is that there are other people in the same tradition who are kind of pushing back, and that's useful, I think.
It seems to me that one of the practical, regardless of the truth claims of any particular religion, one of the practical benefits is the lubrication of like having a vocabulary that is comfortable and that affirms your experience. Like you're okay. Like the thing that you fit. The way you're experiencing the world is the way that it's supposed to be, and the things you like are likable, and the things you find disgusting are disgusting, and like, so it just makes you like able to do the thing you were going to do anyway, with some without all the angst that goes with like, but what if every little detail isn't right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that the nice thing about belonging to a tradition, any tradition, is this sense that although it's true that you own the all the bits of the tradition, it's also the case that on a day when I'm not so sure, that bishops are a good idea or something, right? You can then at least temporarily outsource that to the tradition itself, right? So
Yeah.
I don't love the following example, but it is one that's commonly used, which is that liturgically we often recite the creed using the plural pronoun we, right? So we believe such and such a thing, which for some people helpfully means that on the day when they don't know whether they believe in the Holy Spirit, can still say we believe in the Holy Spirit, because we do, right? Like I don't now, right? But I did last week, and I might next week. But I can still say the we because there's more than me here, and I think belonging to a tradition is helpful in that sense too, because right, like there isn't that pressure at every moment in time to have made sense of every bit of the edifice.
Absolutely. Well, and that's back to, from my perspective, back to the community thing. Like, I don't actually fight fires, but we do. We take care of each other's fires. I'm paying someone else to take care of that for me, but like that's us. Like, we take care of each other. I take care of my neighbors, even though I don't really. But it's something that I think that is good, and that I want to be a part of a group that does that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly.
So then the atheist complaint this whole time is, okay, that's cool, nice story, bro, but is it true? So where do you think they are missing? What do you think they're missing? And what's your response to that? How about I do that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true, right? Like I think a lot of, like I believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, right? Like, I believe Jesus rose from the dead. I believe God exists, etc., etc. So yeah, like I believe it's true. I believe it's important to believe it's true. I don't believe it's important for everyone at every moment in their lives to believe it's true, right? But like it is an important part of the way I see the world, which these are the lenses through which I make sense of the world, right? And in that sense, I think our theological commitments are a bit more like our basic metaphysical commitments than they are like our mundane beliefs about whether or not there's milk in the fridge, or even our like politically fraught scientific quasi beliefs about whether or not climate change is real, right? The belief that climate change is real and caused by humans is a very important belief that entails various decisions, right, about how to live and how to vote, right? But it's not the same kind of thing as the belief that like there is a world, and that I'm a person, right? And I think theological commitments sit somewhere between like basic metaphysical commitments and those kind of more superficial is not the word, like maybe more concrete beliefs or something like this, right? It's having theological commitments is more like having a kind of grammar, right? And having kind of furniture to think through than kind of using appliances, or I'm not sure where this metaphor is going, but like there's something basic about these things, and I think for that reason they're also like less difficult to, they're less amenable to empirical examination on one hand, but also just kind of like rational verification more broadly, right? Like famously, it is difficult to argue your way out of a kind of like skeptical solipsism, right? Famously, it is difficult to identify whether or not there is such a thing as yourself. Like Hume's arguments are still pretty good, and as a scientist, right? Like I spent years of my life worrying about whether or not science tracks truth, right? So there's this question in the philosophy of science, which is like, well, what's the relationship between the stuff that scientists do and say and like the truth with a capital T, right? And naively, we like to think, well, yeah, like what scientists do is we get kind of closer and closer to the truth, right? Like that's what we do. Our theories get better and better. Like obviously that's true. But if you ask a philosopher, right, like of science, whether or not, well, like tell me about the relationship between what scientists do and the truth, the capital T. Like you will spend like weeks with them trying to work out like what the question means, and here are some arguments for, here are some arguments against. And so I remember in graduate school when my philosophy of science lecturer, pointed out that, well, the history of science, right, is a graveyard of failed scientific theories, right, which we now no longer believe to be true. Right. So what makes you think that today's scientific theory happens to be true? Right. Yeah, or truer, right? Oh, yeah. And okay. So this is a good question. Sorry. So truer is important, right?
Right.
What does it mean for one theory to be more true than another theory? Right? So this is a question, so I'm not a philosopher. So this is a question called the question of verisimilitude, right? Which is there a way to express in like structural and logical terms what it means for a theory, let's call it theory A, to be more true or closer to truth than theory B, right? And it turns out that it is remarkably difficult to even describe what that means, right? So the intuitive version of this, which we owe to Karl Popper, who's famous for talking about falsification. The intuitive version of this says something like, well, theory A is closer to the truth than theory B, if and only if theory A generates more true predictions and fewer false predictions, right? And that seems very intuitive. So there are two problems with this, right? So one problem is that, as it turns out, the series of statements that makes up this theory entails a contradiction. I won't get into the proof, but there is one. And so the proof, we owe the proof to a guy called Pavel Tiki. So you can look up Pavel Tiki. He has a proof against Popper's theory of verisimilitude. And that generated like an entire industry of trying to work out how to solve this problem, where the most intuitive way of thinking about the relative truthiness of two theories it's not just problematic, it entails a contradiction. So it cannot be true. Right, like it is necessarily false because it generates a contradiction. So the second problem is that the relationship between theory and hypothesis is itself kind of difficult, right? So famously, a theory entails its hypothesis, right? If the theory is true, then the hypothesis is true. But of course, the converse doesn't hold, right? It's not the case that if the hypothesis is true, then the theory is true. Right? So, if Socrates is a man, right, then he is mortal, right? And so the manness entails the mortalness. But if you discover that Socrates is in fact a man, then you will know that Socrates is mortal infallibly, if the conditional is true. But if you discover that he's mortal, you don't then know that he's a man, because he could be a duck or a giraffe or something, right? Lots of things are mortal. So the relationship between theory and hypothesis works in that kind of a way as well. And so to define the truthiness of theories based simply on their predictions is kind of problematic for that reason, right? Because the observations don't entail the theory, right? And then we have a different problem altogether, right? Which is that when we look at how theories have changed over time, it's precisely not like measurements getting better and better, right? So it's not like, here's a theory. The theory is that like I weigh 70 kilos, I don't know what that is in America.
I don't either.
Yeah, fine.
Okay.
And it turns out that I don't really weigh 70 kilos. Scientist A comes and measures me and goes like, well, I think you're probably closer to 68. And then scientist B comes and goes, I've got an even better measure, right? You're actually 67.8 kilos, and like that's the truth or something like this. And like we think, okay, if that's how science progresses, then yeah, we have a very good account of how science has gotten more and more kind of precisely close to the truth, and that's great. And sometimes science looks like that. So for example, dating the age of the universe or something like this, right? Our numbers seem to be getting better in some way, right? That is straightforwardly quantitative. But sometimes it is our picture of the world that changes, right? In a way that's totally not quantitative. So
Yeah, like what?
well, Newton's universe is completely different from Einstein's universe, right? In one universe, two parallel lines never meet, and in the other universe, they eventually do meet, right? In one universe, like time and space are absolute, and in another, they're not. The two descriptions of reality that Newton and Einstein provide are not like a little bit different from each other in the way that one of them is clearly slightly better than the other one. They're just totally different pictures, right? They're like totally incommensurable, to kind of borrow Thomas Kuhn's kind of phrase. I'm not suggesting that they're evidentially incommensurable, but the pictures are incommensurable. So it's precisely not like getting better measures, right? Like how do you compare two totally different pictures of reality? Right, and if you can't do that, then it makes it difficult to express what it means for one theory to be truer than the other theory. Because it's not like saying, it's, as I say, it's not like saying, oh, like you're 70 kilos and I think you're 70, I think you're 68, and I think you're 69. Let's like work out who is closer. Like that's not how this works, right? It's not like saying, oh, is the dress blue or purple? It's like it's much more qualitatively divergent than that. And so if comparison is difficult, then comparing truthiness is just a part of comparison, right? Then comparing truthiness is itself also difficult. So okay, so we have problems in deciding what it means to believe that a scientific theory is true, right? If that's the case, and take the science case, because there's a lot of empirical observation that's possible, I take that to be the simple case, right? If a simple thing like scientific theories, if we can't quite work out what it means to believe that they're true, it is not obvious to me that we have any hope in working out what it could possibly mean to believe that like much more abstract metaphysical claims are true, right? And so you have two options, right? One option is the one taken in the kind of middle of the 20th century, which is to ban all like truth claims that are not straightforwardly empirical. So it's okay to say that I am 67.9 kilograms in mass, right? But it is not okay to say that dark matter exists or something like that, right? Because once you get to dark matter exists, then you're getting to a metaphysical claim, right? But if you stick to the empirical, you're okay, right? And so you ban all claims about the truth of scientific theories, and you just go with, well, the scientific theory is useful.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? And then you also get rid of all like moral and religious claims because they're all uselessly metaphysical and not at all empirical, right? So you become very austere in what beliefs you accept, right? You accept very few beliefs, and all of them are empirical. Right. You could do that. It seems miserable as a way to live, right? Well,
there are people who live that way that seem not miserable, but like from my perspective, yes.
Are there? I don't know. I'm not persuaded that that's true.
I don't know if they're miserable. They say they're not. So
also they say that they don't have beliefs, right? But I just don't. I'm not persuaded.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I'm not persuaded that it's true that cognitively they're not somehow committed to the things that they say they're not committed to. So you could go that way, right? Or you could kind of relax a little bit, right?
Right.
and kind of construct a set of norms about how you think about our truth commitments,
I want to go back to this science thing, of course, and none of this is what I was planning on talking about. But
Yeah, neither.
I really appreciate your perspective. So then back to the science thing. Like I feel like part of the metaphysical assumptions that we make in order to do science is that whenever we run into a paradox in our data, what we're really missing is an overarching something that explains how both of those are true at the same time. So the Newton's world, of course, and Einstein's world are not actually in conflict. Both of them are wrong to some degree because we're missing, this great unifying theory that may or may not exist. But we can't live with the scientific world can't live with I guess they're just in conflict. Like we have to make the assumption, okay, but maybe that's true, but let's pretend like they're not for the sake of potential progress.
Yeah.
And so even as a Christian, I wanted all of my scientists to just pretend like they were atheists, like none of the religion. Like I want you guys to keep on acting as if the Bible and religion gives us no information about reality, so you guys can make your progress. And meanwhile, I'm going to be living my happy life with these heuristics that work much better and give me more hope and satisfaction as a human being. So I'm going to live my human life. I would like you to keep on working on whatever quantum mechanics stuff you're doing. Good job.
Yeah. So I think there's something interesting here, right? Which is that as it happens, to be a scientist of any kind, but maybe the physics examples are the ones that everyone knows about. So maybe those are the easiest ones. To be a scientist, you need to have quite a high tolerance for seemingly irreconcilable pictures of the world, right? Or theories, right? Because because of physics, famously, there seems to be no way to reconcile general relativity with quantum theory, right? And so one option is to believe, right? Is to have faith that one day there'll be a resolution, right? Another option is to just ignore the contradiction and just to work on one of them, right? So like, I don't work on relativity, I only work on quantum mechanics, right? Like all those people can go and do something else. Like as long as I never talk to them, we don't have to think of the contradiction, that's fine. Or so I know much more about the history of science and about actual physics, right? So for example, in like the sort of middle of the 1800s, right? We notice that the ways in which some of the planets are moving are in contradiction with Newtonian mechanics, right? That the equations don't spit out the thing that we're observing in the sky. So if you're a strict kind of falsificationist, right, you say, well, look, we have evidence that goes against our theory. This means we must abandon our theory, right? We must just not have a theory until we have like a good one, right? So there are some people who say that they like science, who have this view about the world, right? Say, look, if as soon as you discover that there's evidence against your belief, you must abandon your belief altogether, right? That's the view. That's the epistemology. So you would think that that's what they did, right? You would think that that's what physicists did, to go like, okay, like, fuck Newton, right? He's definitely wrong because, Mars and Venus are not, like working appropriately. But literally no one does this.
Well, you can't.
Yeah, exactly.
Is why yeah.
Yeah. Like,
which is why you still have religion. Like you can't live as if there is no love in the world. You can't live as if hope is not a real thing, or as if God doesn't exist. Like these heuristics work better than whatever might be actually true.
Yeah, maybe they work better, but I think the important lesson from the scientists is that actually in science there is just a lot of tolerance for holding on to beliefs that seem not to conform to reality as empirically observed, right? There's a lot of tolerance for holding on to theories that seem contradictory and or incommensurate with one another, right? That at an epistemic level, forgetting whether or not it's true, right? At an epistemic level, the rule isn't once you decide that the evidence isn't sufficient, you should abandon your theory. The rule isn't once you discover a contradiction, you should abandon both of the propositions, right? It's much more kind of like messy than that. Like, I'm not suggesting that the lesson from science is like we should happily believe in contradictions left, right, and center, right? Or we should believe like anything we please regardless of how it conforms to or contradicts the evidence, right? But I am saying that the opposite also isn't true, right? That kind of very austere, like epistemologically rigorous, right, like way of navigating the world, like isn't how scientists behave, right? And,
Wait, state the opposite for me.
The opposite of
You said the opposite isn't true. Can you say what the opposite would be as a statement?
So the two ends of the scale are like believe whatever you like, right? Ignore the evidence, ignore the logic, right? Just believe whatever makes you happy. That's one end of the scale. I think that I'm not saying that that's the thing, but I think it's important to remember that the opposite, which is that you can only believe things for which you have lots and lots of evidence, and you must never believe in any contradictions, and you should abandon your beliefs as soon as you discover difficulties. I think that's also not true, right? But that seems to be what some kinds of atheists expect religious people to do. And so your question was like, where do atheists sometimes kind of get it wrong? Like, I think that's where they get it wrong, right? Which is a kind of like, look, the kind of evidential hygiene that you're expecting of religious people is not even a standard of evidential hygiene that is held onto by the scientific community, right? Nor has it ever been, right? Because knowing stuff is hard.
Well, and I feel like we know things that we can't prove.
Yeah.
So, like, for my favorite example is like you go back before germ theory, and like, so let's say people believe that it's spirits that make other people sick, and you better not go close to that person because they have the spirits. Well, it's not wrong. It's not right, but also you guys should live that way. Like you need to believe in that. That's good. That's really going to help you out. You're totally dead wrong, but you have intuited the right thing, even though you don't have the evidence to prove that it's right yet. And so later on, we're going to change the language, the vocabulary, but that fact is still going to remain.
Yeah, that's right. And there's an analog of this in the philosophical and theological issues, right? So it's not that like the practical ramifications of any given theological commitment or philosophical view is much less direct than if you wash your hands then you probably won't get cholera, right? Like the relationship between like disease and belief is much more tenuous in the kind of philosophical and theological case, but it's not totally absent, right? I think there's a habit these days of strictly divorcing what you might call systematic theology or dogmatic theology on one hand, and sort of pastoral theology and moral theology on the other, right? And I think both camps of people who do one kind of theology versus the other are a bit snotty about each other, right? So the pastoral and moral theologians are snotty about the systematicians because they think that they're just kind of sitting in the ivory tower thinking lofty thoughts that don't mean anything to anybody. But conversely, the systematicians think that the moral and pastoral theologians are a bit stupid, right? And that's putting it a little bit harsh, right? But like I've definitely been to conferences when I can see that people are a bit sneery about one another. But that's crazy, right? Because one of the ways in which we evolve as a theological tradition is by testing whether or not our theological commitments kind of work as they play out in ecclesial and pastoral and missional contexts, right? I deeply, one of my like methodological commitments is that the best theologians are on the ground visiting the sick and celebrating the sacraments and marrying people and baptizing babies and burying the dead, and that the thought that you could do Christian theology divorced from that kind of very practical setting seems totally absurd to me. Right. And one of the tests of whether or not a theology might be true, right? Whether or not it's getting at something real about the divine, I think that can really only be tested out in the real world, right? In chapels and churches and out on the streets and in people's homes. But it doesn't happen as much as it should, right? That there is almost a proud anti-intellectualism among ministers of religion who say, I don't need academic theology. I'm just going to visit little old ladies and bury the dead and do this important pastoral work. I'm never going to read a book again as soon as I'm ordained. And then the converse kind of snobbery happens in the academy when they think that they never need to talk to pastors and missionaries and lay people, and they can just read their books and parse Greek verbs or something. But they're both wrong, right? They're both deeply wrong. Is that you can't really know what you're doing pastorally unless you have a kind of theological foundation, and you can't test your theology outside of the context of the work that God has called us to do.
It feels to me like the person who takes the first route and is like, I don't need any more books. I don't need to learn any more about this. I need to visit the old ladies. They're probably, they're going to be factually wrong about a lot of things, and they're going to miss a lot of potential revelations that would likely enrich their lives and maybe their ministry. But also, I don't know that, we live pretty short lives. That will probably work until you die. For you, like, I don't know that you need to get smarter if you are living a rich human experience. I don't know. I kind of have that's kind of romantic again for me to feel like, well, actually that might be what, from my perspective, what religion is getting at, is allowing you to get into the human experience. Because this is so much more, living as a human is so much more complex than just germ theory. Like, germs are simple in comparison to the lives that we're trying to live. And the kind of heuristic that you would need, religion seems like such a complex, whatever that is, encapsulation of like a million things that you need to know that you can't possibly know. But God helps you get there to all the million points that you need to.
Yeah, and I think it's true in general that certain kinds of intellectual questions, and mostly maybe questions that begin with the word why, I think lots of questions like that are kind of luxury, right?
Oh yeah.
The how question is the basic question, where I come from Malaysia originally, and in Malaysia, like the scientific research we care about is the scientific research that will like increase our crop yield, right? Because we need to feed people, right? And when I was growing up, the project of the nation was to bring a whole bunch of people out of poverty into something like a middle class. No one had time for quantum mechanics. Right, this is like that. That's not what we care about. Like we want to do like agricultural science and like civil engineering or whatever, right? And then right, and so if quantum mechanics is on that end of the spectrum, then of course like metaphysical questions about God, right, and the resurrection and the Trinity are like even further from there, right, further from our practical concerns, and so the luxury to ask questions about the nature of angels or whatever, like that really is a luxury, right? That you need to have already satisfied a bunch of like the low levels of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs before you get to this kind of like very kind of abstruse kinds of questions. But I think that again the analogy between theology and science is kind of useful here. Is that to say that there are some contexts in which applied science is what we need mostly, right? Is not to say that there should never be any room for theoretical, right, blue sky kind of science, right? And in the same way, I think to say that in any season of a minister's life, I don't have time to read so and so's latest book on such and such a thing. Like I have like 9 funerals this week, whatever, and I think that's fine, right? But I think on the horizon, just as the applied scientist has to acknowledge that there is some kind of necessity for more abstract looking science, because there is this kind of feedback loop between the two, right? I think the same is true for the minister to go like, oh yes, like I'm in a very busy season now, but one day, right, like I should sit down to reread Basil, right, and that might make a difference in the way I do ministry, and the way I do ministry might shape the way I understand Basil, and so it goes.
I'm increasingly appreciative throughout my life that there are people who seem to have different circuits switched in their brains, that they do or don't care about those other things, because it's not like there is one human experience that we're supposed to all aim for. Like, there's just some people that like don't have the wiring to care about the things that, like they don't care about the crop yield, and they're like just fascinated by, okay, but what about angels? Like, and they're just fixated on that.
Yeah.
And like, good for them. Like they're going to help us learn something in a time where that's completely impractical. So good for them. That's my like blue skies stuff, is just like, if that's what you have to do and that's your journey in your life, then we're going to benefit from that probably eventually, or at least benefit from watching you fail. Either way,
right.
If that's what you have to do, go for it.
That has to be right? That, because our lives are finite, as you were saying, right? Like we can't all do everything, and so some of us get to do the things that that kind of resonate with us, and we have this kind of, we're wrestling with this thing at the moment in the Church of England about who should be a bishop, right? So we have a bunch of bishops, and the question is, well, like what kinds of skills are important to be a bishop? And this is live at the moment in the kind of conversation about the Church of England, which is, to be clear, a very abstruse, and like there are like 7 people who care about this. But so like on Anglican Twitter or whatever, this is live because we have just appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury.
Okay.
Who is a bit like, people hate it when we say this, but it's a bit like having the Pope, but for Anglicans, right? It's a bit like that. So because that's in the air, there's this question of, well, like what kind of person should lead the Anglican Communion? Right? What should their qualifications be? Right? What should their demeanor be? What should their skill sets be? That kind of thing. And I think one of the dimensions has always been, well, should it be someone who has like run a large organization before, right? Like is that the main set of skills that we care about, like kind of like managerial, right, CEO type person, or should it be an academic, right? Like should it be someone who is like an esteemed theologian, very, very smart and learned and all the rest of it, or should it be like basically like a monk who's extremely holy and only reluctantly ever leaves his cell, and so we have to drag him to the cathedral to ordain him and make him into the archbishop, and so we have these conversations are going on, and so I think so forget the archbishop for a second, but like just think about the bishops, and there are like a bunch of them, there are dozens of bishops. I have never thought that all of them need to have doctorates in theology, right? Like it's not everyone's calling, and nor is it every bishop's calling to be like first-rate theologians, right? Or even second-rate theologians. I don't know, let's not be choosy, right? Like, but it is true that one of the traditional and inherent roles of the episcopacy, of the bishops as a body, is a doctrinal one, right? And also one of like religious pedagogy. The bishops, we say, have the role of handing down the faith to us from generation to generation, and so they probably better understand it, right? Now, so I want to hold both truths, right? So on one hand, I don't think that every bishop has to have like a PhD in systematic theology. On the other hand, as a body, they need to be equipped to fulfill the role of teaching, right? And that means that some of them better have PhDs in theology, right? Now, how many of them, I don't know, right? But probably more than 3. If they're going to be like 100 of them, or I have no idea how many bishops there are. But like, you don't know what the proportion is. But like, I think we can say some of you probably should be quite learned, right? But not all of you need to be.
If the group has a job, then you can have some diversity within the group. Like if it was only one bishop, then probably you're going to get more specific and care more about.
That's right.
That, but
yeah, exactly.
Thank you all for joining me. Unfortunately, we didn't get to the thing that Dr. Jonathan Lewis-Jong is most known for, which is CSR, or the cognitive science of religion, or the way I would put it, the psychology of belief.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So are we going to talk about psychology at some point? Just like
that was planning on it.
Which is like my thing. It's the only thing I actually know anything about.
So make sure you're subscribed to get notified of that episode of His Even Greater Passion is released. If you wish you could drop me a note of encouragement or something like that, you can. It takes like 3 seconds to go to the 5 stars and click that. It's just a quick way to say, hey, little buddy, I think you're doing an all right job. I mean, we're all little, right? We're all doing our best here. So from me to you, hey, little buddy, I think you're doing all right. I'm rooting for you, and you should too.